I want to talk about a future you might live in. And I want to start with the word might, because I'm going to be arguing that there are a set of technologies we now have which make possible a future in which transactions online are invisible except to the people who are making them. And thus a future in which you have a government that still rules real space, but essentially anarchy in cyberspace. The critical technology is something called public key encryption, which is one of these revolutionary things that nobody knows about. How many people here are familiar with public key encryption? So I ought to explain it. I want to send somebody a message and make sure that if somebody else intercepts it, he can't read it. And the traditional way is that I have something called a key, which describes how I'm going to scramble the message. And I use that key to scramble it. The person I'm sending the message to has the key and can use it to unscramble it, and thus if somebody in between intercepts the message, he can't understand it. And the trouble with that is that it requires some safe way in which I can get the key from me to the person who I'm going to deal with. And if I don't have a safe way of transmitting messages, which is the reason I need encryption, I may not have a safe way of transmitting keys. And if I want to be able to have private messages not only with my friends but with strangers, it is unlikely that I will have a secure way of giving the key only to the people who I want to be able to read my messages. What public key encryption is a mathematical process that generates a pair of keys such that if you encrypt with one key, you need the other one to decrypt. And it works in either direction. So the idea of the simple way of using public key encryption is you create a pair of keys. One of them you decide to make your public key, and you give that to everybody in the world, everybody who might want to communicate with you. And the other is your private key, and you never give it to anybody at all. Now, if I want to send a message, I encrypt the message with my private key, send it out, you decrypt it with the public key. That's no good, because everybody else has a public key. But if you want to send a message to me, you encrypt the message with the public key. Only I have the private key to decrypt it. So by making my public key public, I arrange that everybody out there can send me messages that only I can read. All right? And of course, if the person I'm communicating with has also made his public key public, then I can use that to encrypt messages to him. So simply, as long as you've got some way of distributing keys that doesn't have to be secret, you can arrange it so that everybody can send secret messages to everybody else. It turns out that that also gives you a second useful feature, namely the ability to prove who you are. Because suppose I want to send you a message, and I not only want to make sure that nobody who intercepts it can read it, I also want to make sure that you know I'm me, and not someone else pretending to be me. So what do? I write my message, I encrypt it with my private key, I then encrypt that with your public key, including a note saying this is from David Friedman. I send that to you. You decrypt the message with your private key. You then decrypt the message with my public key. It's got 2 layers of encryption. Since the fact that it's not gibberish means that it was encrypted with the private key that matches my public key, which only I have, the result is I've now proven that the message comes from me. This is the basic principle of digital signatures. I'm simplifying down a good deal. Digital signatures in the real world have some additional complications to make them easier, but that's the guts of the method. Now, being able to communicate with people privately and prove their identity is very useful. But if I'm worried about people watching me, I would also like the communication to be untraceable. Because after all, if I am doing something other people might object to, if I am, for example, saying things heretical in terms of the religion of the country I live in, or if I'm organizing a revolution, or if I'm engaged in some illegal industry, or if there are other reasons people care about it, the knowledge of who I'm talking to could also be valuable to them. even if they don't know what I'm saying. And in fact, as you may know, it turns out that the National Security Agency in the US has been maintaining information for the phone system of who calls whom but not what they say without having search warrants for quite a while. And you can see why that would be useful from their standpoint. And the solution to that problem is an idea called an anonymous remailer. And the way an anonymous remailer works is that I want to send a message to this gentleman here, but I don't want this gentleman here to know I did it. So over in the corner, we've got somebody who's in the business of anonymous remailers. And I am going to send the message to him, and he's going to forward it to you. Now you say, that's no good, because all he has to do is to watch the messages going into him and coming out to him. But he has a public key, private key too, like everybody in the world in this future I'm describing. So what I do is I encrypt the message with the recipient's public key. I add to that the recipient's email address, encrypt that whole package with his public key, send it to him. He strips off one layer of encryption. He now has the email address to forward it. He forwards it to this gentleman. Now, that means that somebody who intercepts the message on the way to him can't know where it's going. But somebody could still be watching messages in, messages out. So for this to work, we need an anonymous remailer that's getting in 1,000 messages a minute, sending out 1,000 messages a minute. You can't match up in and out because with stripping off one layer of encryption, they no longer look the same. So even somebody who is able to I'm assuming a world where the observer can read all of our email. And even in that world, we have complete privacy. Because he observes that I sent a message to him. He observes that he sent a message to him, but he doesn't know which of the 1,000 messages that just got forwarded was my message. All right so far? The only problem is, what if he's working for the bad guys? All right, I'm not sure if I trust his face. But that's all right. Because the email address that I sent him isn't actually his email address. It's his email address because he's another anonymous remailer. And what goes to him isn't really his email address, it's his email address. So that you bounce the message through a chain of remailers. And unless all of them are not only working for bad guys, but working for the same bad guy, there is no way of tracing the message from me to him. So I've just described a set of things that we all have known how to do for 20 or 30 years now, since public key encryption is not that new, which allow a world where strangers can communicate in complete privacy, and where I can have a reputation which is tied to my public key, tied to my online identity, without anybody having to know my real space identity. All right, I'll come back in a little while to ways in which that might be very useful. Now, there's still one piece of the puzzle that we need. Because many of the things people do, including many of the things other people don't want them to do, involve paying each other. So we need a way of making payments online, which is similarly invisible. And there is a technical solution to this, which was created by a Dutch cryptographer called David Chown, easily 2 or 3 decades ago. And I'm not going to try to describe how it works. I will only tell you the result, which is that I can send you a piece of information which gives you access to some money, takes the access away from me, and does not require either of us to know who the other is, and does not require the bank holding the money to know who either of us is. If people are sufficiently curious, if you look in my book, Future Imperfect, which you can buy in print, but you can also read online from my webpage, I have a low-tech version, not Xiaomi Digital Cash, which is complicated, but a way in which, without using encryption, just using the man at the post office, you could get the equivalent of digital cash. There is, however, a practical problem with Xiaomi Digital Cash, and that is it requires a bank. That there has got to be an institution actually holding the money, so what I'm really doing is giving you the information that gives you control over a dollar bill instead of my having control over it. And if I were giving this talk, and because I did give something along these lines 20 or 25 years ago, I would say, look, in another 10 or 20 years, we'll have anonymous digital cash along these lines. And I'd be wrong. It hasn't happened. And I think the reason Xiaomi digital cash doesn't exist is that it requires a trusted bank in a reasonably respectable country, so that you can be fairly sure that once you deposit money with them, it's yours until you pay it to someone else online. And all of the respectable countries don't want anonymous digital cash to exist, because if anonymous digital cash exists, money laundering laws become unenforceable. That a number of the ways in which governments enforce their laws depend on the possibility of tracing money. And as I will be arguing at the end, to some extent the governments are right. That is, some of the things that one can do with anonymous digital cash are things I would rather that people not be able to do. But others are things they would be able to do. So I am not arguing that the society that I'm going to be describing or the institutions are entirely good. I'm going to argue that they make the world substantially different from what it is, and in some ways better. I'll get back to that later. But of course, if I was giving this talk 25 years ago, I wouldn't know about Bitcoin because it didn't exist yet. And Bitcoin is a very ingenious way of having a digital currency that doesn't require a bank, which is why Xiaomi digital cash doesn't exist and Bitcoin does. Unfortunately, Bitcoin is also the least anonymous money that has ever existed in the history of the world, because, as those familiar with it know, part of the way it works is that when I make a transaction, what account the money was paid from and what account it was paid to is public information to everybody using Bitcoin. All right? So as it now exists, Bitcoin gives you a digital cash, not quite an anonymous one. I say not quite because what's not anonymous is the account, not the person. So you could imagine a future in which I have two Bitcoin accounts. One of them is the Bitcoin account of my real space identity, and one is the Bitcoin account of my cyberspace identity, my online identity. And the people who are watching the communications can observe that money was paid in Bitcoins to my online identity, but that doesn't tell them who it went to. After all of these transactions depend on having a visible online identity whose public key is what I've distributed. So all you need in order to make Bitcoin able to function as an anonymous digital currency is a secure way of moving Bitcoins between your real space account and your cyberspace account that nobody else can observe. I gather that this is an issue people are working on, that there are people who have proposals for anonymous versions of things like Bitcoin. And as far as I can tell, in principle, all you need is the equivalent anonymous remailer, so that you are sending the money to an account which sends it on to you using the same methods I've described to keep it being traced. But it does have to be an anonymous remailer you can trust, because whereas the worst thing that happens with anonymous remailers for messages is the message gets lost, in the case of Bitcoin, the anonymous remailer could choose to transfer the money to his account instead of mine. So you would need some institutions to get you trustworthy remailers. All right. So I've now described, I think, all of the relevant parts of the technology, and I now want to describe the world that creates, what I refer to as a world of strong privacy. I should say, by the way, I didn't invent all of this stuff. There were a bunch of people more than 20 years ago who referred to themselves as the cypherpunk group, who were discussing these ideas. And I picked up on it, had some interest in encryption initially, and was especially interested in the economics. And to some extent, this was a case of some of them stealing some of my ideas about how you would function without the state, processing them, and then my stealing them back so that I could use them to see how this was relevant to this new technology. So it gives you a world where online transactions, including purchases, are invisible to third parties, including the state. What does that mean? One of the things it means is that online transactions cannot be taxed. You can't tax what you can't see. You could voluntarily pay a tax, of course, if you chose, but most people choose not to. Now, it's a little complicated. If I earn money in cyberspace and then spend it in real space, the government can tax my purchases. If I earn money in real space and spend it in cyberspace, the government can tax my income. But if I earn money in cyberspace and spend it in cyberspace, that's tax-free. So how important this is, to what degree it reduces the ability of governments to collect money, is largely going to depend on how much of people's lives is happening in cyberspace and how much in real space. So if you are a freelance computer programmer, somebody advertises, I want the following program written, using his anonymous identity, you do the same thing, you get that money, you then spend that money buying software or songs or anything else that's in informational process and therefore can be handled in cyberspace, that's going to be invisible to your third parties. There's a problem that may have occurred to you with this system, and that is, how do we enforce law, and in particular, how do we enforce contracts online? All right, one of the nice things about online is that there is a sense in which everything that happens online is voluntary. You can't get a bullet through a T1 line. You can fool people. You can have fraud, but you can't have force. All right? You have things that look a little bit like force, but they all depend on your being careless, on your letting somebody else get control over your hardware by making a mistake. So the question is that when you want to hire me to write a computer program for you, there are two ways we could cheat. I could say, fine, pay me. It costs $500, and you pay me, and you never hear from me again. Alternatively, you could say, write the program, and if it's satisfactory, I'll pay you. And I write the program and send it to you, and I never hear from you again. So we need some mechanism for enforcing the contracts that happen in this anonymous world. And the mechanism that seems most plausible is reputation. That if you have an online identity linked to your public key, you would like people to trust you. For one thing, if they trust you, they will pay you in advance, which solves the problem of they're not paying you when you do the work. So that means that in this world, you build up a reputation over time. And the obvious way is by doing transactions that don't involve too much of a risk of cheating repeatedly until you have a reputation so that people will trust you. Having that reputation is valuable to you, so you have an incentive not to cheat them and mess up the reputation. There are other ways that you could, as it were, bond your reputation. Right? Suppose I want to make sure that people know I can be trusted. The reason that they know I can be trusted is that if I cheat them, everybody's going to find out, and I'll discuss in a minute how they find out. I don't have time to do 100 different transactions and slowly build up my reputation. So instead what I do is I donate $5,000 anonymously, but it's real space anonymously, cyberspace not anonymously, to some worthy cause. And the worthy cause, which people do trust, is willing to publicly testify that I made that donation. What am I doing? I'm bonding my reputation. I'm creating a situation where I lose something important to me if I cheat you and people find out. It's expensive, but I now have a valuable reputation. I can make many transactions over time using that reputation. An alternative, and one which may explain some things we see in the real world, where reputation also matters, is I do a lot of advertising. I do expensive advertising in order that everybody will know about me, to make sure my public key is widely available and so forth. And after I've done that for a while, people say, well, he wouldn't have spent all that money on advertising if he was planning to cheat somebody once and throw away his reputation. And I think that describes what really happens in the real world. That it is common in the US, I don't know about Sweden, that banks, especially banks built in the 19th century when we had essentially free banking, are fancy buildings with lots of shiny marble on them. Why? Because once I have built such a building, which isn't worth much for anything other than a bank, it's not likely that I will get people to deposit their money in my bank, put all the money in my suitcase, and leave town. Right? So that was a way in which, in real space transactions, people in effect bonded their reputation. There is, however, a problem with reputational enforcement. And the problem with reputational enforcement is that it is a side effect. All right? If you have a policeman who is being paid to enforce the law, what he is trying to do with any luck is enforce the law. But reputation, the enforcement is being done by the interested third parties who, after they find out you cheated me, don't want to deal with you. All right? So you are being injured not because anybody wants to hurt you. The way I usually tell the story, again, in real space, is to imagine that I go to a department store and I buy myself a jacket. And the department store says, satisfaction or your money back. And I take the jacket home, and my wife points out that purple is really not my color, and besides, it doesn't fit me. So I take it back to the department store. And the question is, why do they give me my money back? Well, maybe in the world as it is, I could sue them. But it's really, lawyers are pretty expensive. Nobody really expects to be sued for the value of one jacket. The reason they give the money back is that they want to maintain their reputation not only with me, but with everybody else, that they keep their word. And what happens if they don't? Other people stop buying from them. Not to punish them. It's not that they want to revenge me. Even people who don't like me stop buying from them because they don't want to get cheated. Suppose, however, that the interested third parties have no easy way of finding out whether I'm telling the truth when I accuse the department store of cheating. The department store says, we didn't cheat him. Did you see the condition that jacket was in when he brought it back to us? All right. So that means if the interested third parties can't easily tell who is cheating, do you see what's going to happen? What do you as a prudent person do when you say, I had a transaction with him. I claimed he cheated me, and he said, no, I was trying to cheat him. What does a prudent person do? He avoids dealing with either of us. All right, he doesn't know which one is lying. But if I know that the result of reporting his cheating me is that people won't deal with me, I'll never report it because it makes me worse off, not better off. So what that tells us is that in order for reputational enforcement to work, you need low-cost ways in which interested third parties can figure out who is telling the truth, who is cheating. And it just happens that the technology I just told you about provides a very simple and elegant solution to that problem, a way of telling who cheated. So we go back to the computer program, and he hired me to write a computer program, and we wrote a contract. And the contract described whatever it described, but at the end it said the public key of the arbitrator we have chosen to judge this contract is such and such, his public key. All right? So now I write a fine computer program, I send it to him, and never hear from him. So I left out one thing. We write this contract, and both of us digitally sign it. All right? We encrypt it both with my private key and separately with his private key. And each of us keeps copies. So now, what happens when he doesn't pay me for the program is I send that signed contract to him, and I say, look, you're the arbitrator we agreed in, you're in the arbitration business, we chose you because you know computer stuff and you can see if I really wrote the contract I agreed to wrote the program I agreed to write. And he looks at it and says, yep, that program satisfies the conditions in the contract, you owe him $500. If he doesn't pay, he then writes his verdict that this person signed a contract with this person, again, these are all online identities, and then violated it and refused to pay the damages he had agreed to pay. And he digitally signs it. And notice that the contract itself contains his public key, which means that anybody who looks at his verdict and the contract knows that it was the arbitrator we agreed on who says that he cheated me. And furthermore, anybody who checks the digital signatures on the contract knows that both of us agreed to that arbitrator in advance. So I've just described a mechanism by which you can sign a contract such that at the cost of, let us say, 1/4 of a second of computer time, anybody who wants to can find out who cheated. Or at least who the arbitrator they agreed on said cheated, which is as close as you can, I think, hope to get. So this gives us then a mechanism which the combination of arbitration and digital signatures that solves the problem of how do you maintain a reputation in cyberspace in a world of anonymity. Let me now tell you about the downside of a world of strong privacy, because this is by no means an unambiguously good change, though it's an interesting change. One of the effects is that it becomes harder for the government to collect taxes, and some people will see that as a bug, and some people will see that as a feature. But it also makes a variety of versions of crime easier, including some we don't want to make easier. All right? I assume that most people in the room can think of at least one law they would like to have unenforceable. So making crime easier is not always a bad thing. But you can probably also think of one or two laws you'd like to have enforceable. For example, the law against murder. So let me give you my business plan for Murder Incorporated. All right? This is going to be a firm that sells the service of private assassination. And, you know, many people could think of someone they like dead for a variety of different reasons. The reason that it isn't practical for an ordinary citizen, as opposed to a government agent or a professional criminal, to hire an assassination is not the price. As best I can tell from what stories one sees about what goes on in the criminal world, the cost of a hitman is probably less than the cost of a new car. And most of us can afford a new car if we really sufficiently badly want it. The problem in this market is we don't have a safe way of contacting a reliable seller of this service. And trying to contact a reliable seller of this service might get us into trouble. All right? This problem we can solve. So this is the business plan for Murder Incorporated. Billboards go up in various prominent places. And all the billboards have is a long number plus write down this number. And some noticeable number of people do. This number, you will not be surprised to hear, is a public key. The next step is that a classified ad appears in the New York Times and a few other publications, which appears to be gibberish. The step after that is a very high-profile assassination. I'm not sure that politicians are important enough. I think maybe a bomb at the Academy Awards would do it. But one that makes all the newspapers. And then an ad is published saying, use the number that was up on those billboards to decrypt the ad that was in the New York Times last week. And that ad is a description of the assassination posted a couple of days before it happened. You now know the public key of an organization that kills people. You should be able, with a little bit of effort, to fill out the rest of the story and see how this organization can now sell the service of hiring hitmen. Because you know now the information needed both to send them secret messages and to tell whether a message is really from them. Because once you have their public key, you both can use it to send the messages and to recognize their digital signature. So now they're going to set up, obviously, additional institutions with remailers and stuff like that. And now anybody who wants to get somebody knocked off can send them a message saying, what is your price for this particular service? And you get back a message saying, it costs $11,000 in anonymous digital cash, of course. And we really wouldn't want to have a bad reputation because then nobody would hire us. And therefore you pay them and they kill somebody. Now, this doesn't entirely solve the problem of killing people. The killing itself is in real space, after all. We do have sort of cyberspace murders. They're called DDoS attacks, distributed denial of service, but that's a good deal less serious than actually killing. But this is being done by professionals, and they can presumably work out plausible ways of killing people with only a small risk of getting caught. If you think about it, killing people is not all that hard, right? Killing people and not getting caught. It takes a lot of work to protect somebody like the President of the U.S., who many people, for any president at all, might want to kill. That's been true for all previous presidents. Probably for Swedish equivalents as well. I know less about your politicians than about our politicians. Notice how, let me go on to a more disturbing case, because it's one that I think is likely to be more common, and that's kidnapping. That kidnapping or extortion in general, a good deal of the way people are caught at present is by tracing the money. That when you have a payoff, you watch it or you use marked bills, and you then find out who got it. That's not going to work. That in general, all forms of law enforcement that depend on tracing money payments become unworkable once you've got a reliable anonymous digital cash. And in fact, we actually have an example of this that some of you may have noticed a week or so ago, maybe a little more than that. And that was the ransomware attack. That people managed to get at computers whose owners had been careless, whose owners had not upgraded with the patch that Microsoft had set out some time back to patch a particular security hole. And what do you do when you can get control over a computer? I don't know the details of what they did, but I discussed this idea long before this happened. But what you basically do is you encrypt all the information on that computer. You save to that computer's hard drive the encrypted version, wiping out the non-encrypted version. You have a copy of the key. This doesn't even require a public key. You just use an ordinary key to scramble the information. And then you tell the people whose computer you have temporarily borrowed that they can have the information back if they pay you. And if they pay you, you send them the key, they unscramble the message, and they're back where they were before. And of course, the payment will be in Bitcoin. And presumably it will go to an account which you don't think is linked to your real space account. And as best I can tell, that's what actually happened with the recent ransomware attack, and thus gives me a real-world example of the problem that I'm discussing. Notice, however, that while this set of institutions provides ways of attacking you that weren't practical before, it also provides ways of defending you. That after all, one of the reasons people want to assassinate you is that you are doing things they don't want you to do. And if you're doing those things online, using the technology I'm describing, they know your online identity, but they don't know whether you're a man or a woman, 25 or 70, or what continent you live on, which makes it really hard to assassinate you. All right? So in some ways, the same strong privacy that I'm describing provides you a defense as well as new ways of attacking. And that's true not only for murder, but for extortion. Because the obvious reason to want to extort somebody is the knowledge that he's got lots of money. And if you are earning your money and spending your money mostly in invisible online ways, nobody knows you're rich. So that in fact, if I want to think about who are the people for this sort of thing would be most useful initially, it would be high productivity people in the kind of society where if you have a high income and someone is going to steal it. All right? So suppose you're a really good computer programmer in Malaya, India, you probably, I'm not an expert on these countries, but in some country where either private kidnappers are likely to kidnap your kid if they know you have money, or the government is likely to invent some excuse for taking money from you if they know you have money. What you do is you do all your transactions online, you accumulate lots and lots of digital currency, and you live the same life as all the rest of your neighbors until you're rich enough to retire, and you then leave the country and go somewhere else where it's safer to have money. So that's a real possibility. And as it happens, the people who invented PayPal were originally intending PayPal to be a way of making anonymous transactions using Palm Pilots. I happened to hear a talk on this in the early days of PayPal. And the idea, they were specifically targeting people in the third world who wanted to be able to do transactions which involved money without being visible to either their neighbors or their government. And they gave up on that project for some reason, and PayPal at this point is not a solution to these problems. But they were, in fact, thinking of that issue, which shows you if you have a really great idea and sell out, you might be able to make $1 billion, as they did, more than that. Right? So we have a sort of a tension between the advantages and the disadvantages of this world. Let's consider, though, in a more general sense, what that world looks like. And the first question that matters is how important cyberspace is. That if cyberspace is 10% of people's lives, then all this means is there are a few people who can get away with tax evasion. What if cyberspace is 90% of people's lives? This is not an absurd idea, because as virtual reality gets better and better, the number of things that can be done online becomes larger and larger. Day after tomorrow, I am flying to Georgia, where I'm going to be giving some talks. This is not the first time I've given a talk in Georgia, but it's the first time I've been in Georgia. All right? Sometime within the last year, I gave a talk in Georgia, sitting in my office in San Jose, California. I was using Skype. They could see me. They had a video camera pointed at the audience, so I could see them. I had done the same thing in the Netherlands, maybe 15 years earlier or so, except that required a very expensive room. I think it was in the business school, which had a wall of glass that was a screen. It had, I don't know what cameras, and I assume there was something fancy at the other end as well. Now I can do it from my office using stuff that all of us, pretty much all of us do. So we are moving towards a world where very large parts of the things humans do can be done online. And in that world, you can end up with what's essentially an anarcho-capitalist society, a society where all transactions are voluntary, where we do our law enforcement via private arbitrators using reputation as our enforcement mechanism, at the same time that there are then states in real space. Furthermore, in this world, the states in real space are going to face a problem. Because the larger the amount of your life is in cyberspace, the less you care where you are physically located. And that means that in a world where many people are living mainly online, transacting mainly online, many people are also very mobile. And that means that governments are becoming something less like states and more like landlords. They can control physical space, so they can say, if you want to live here, here's the property tax. They'll be competing with other alternative providers of that service, though. So if they try to charge you more than somebody else can provide you a place to live with, they're not going to have any customers. And this is reminding me of a passage in an essay I read a long time ago by an author who you've probably never heard of, most of you, but who I'm rather fond of, an English academic called C. Northcott Parkinson. And what Parkinson was very good at was writing humorous essays making serious points. And his most famous essay is called Parkinson's Law. And Parkinson's Law has two statements. One of them is work expands to fill the time available. And the other is the number of people employed in a bureaucracy increases at a constant rate, whether the amount of work to do increases, decreases, or whether there's any work at all. And this sounds like a joke until you look at his data. Because the essay graphs the number of people employed by the onshore establishment of the British Admiralty, the clerks for the Navy, during the period when England went from the greatest naval power in the world, with a navy designed to be able to take on any other two navies in the world, to the point where they were barely able to beat Argentina. Number of clerks went up. He has a similar graph for the establishment of the British Empire during the time when the British Empire disappeared. So Parkinson's a lot of fun, and he's pretty clever. Well, he's not alive anymore. Clever guy. But one of his other essays, which is the equivalent rule for expenditure, he has a neat bit where he's discussing the bit in the Bible where the Israelites are being oppressed in Egypt, and they and Moses leave. And the way Parkinson puts it is, the productive people of the world have discovered, by long and bitter experience, that they will usually have to give about 10% of their income to some gangster, feudal lord, or Department of Internal Revenue. It matters little what you call it. When the rates get higher than that, the Israelites start looking at the atlas. There are probably better places to be than Egypt. Now, Parkinson was optimistic on his numbers, as we all know. It turns out that they can get away with more than 10%. But the underlying point, I think, is an important point, and that is that the ability of governments to exploit the people they rule is constrained by how difficult it is to lead. If this were another talk, I'd tell you about my first Economics Journal article, which was an attempt to explain the map of Western Europe from the fall of the Roman Empire to the present on the basis of essentially that. Roughly speaking, but what that means is that if we end up with a world where people live a large part of their life in cyberspace, governments in real space will become much less powerful than they now are, because people are more mobile. A year or two ago, I went on a speaking trip to India and Bali, and I brought my adult daughter with me. And she is building a career as an online freelance editor. If any of you have written fiction, especially science fiction or fantasy fiction, in English, and you want an editor, I can point you at a good editor. She continued to do her work with the same projects and the same customers in India, because she's doing all of it online anyway, and it doesn't matter whether she's in California. And I think that's a pattern which over time is going to become increasingly common. So I've described what the world looks like and how it could happen. And now let me talk a little bit about why it might not happen. And there are basically two reasons it might not happen. One of them is there's a coordination problem. That in order for this to work, you have to have a public key infrastructure in which there are ways in which people can get their public keys public, in which they can distribute them, all the rest of what I'm describing. These don't appear instantly out of the air. People have to build those institutions. And second, there are a lot of governments which would prefer that this not happen for reasons that by now should be pretty obvious. Oh, actually, it occurred to me I skipped my other business plan. I think I can afford a few more minutes. Let me give, since I gave the business plan for a bad arrangement, let me give you my good business plan. This one is imaginary, but it's imaginary only because I'm not competent to give legal advice. I'm currently a law professor. I will be a law professor about another month. I'm retiring. But I'm actually an academic economist, not a lawyer. I was hired by a law school to teach various stuff involving economics and law. But suppose I were competent to give legal advice, but was not a member of the California bar, meaning I was not licensed to give advice in California. This is not a problem, because after all, legal advice is an informational product. It's a service which can be provided online just fine. So I set up as Legal Eagle Online. I roll up a public key, private key pair. I put up a web page. The web page says, Legal Eagle Online will give you free legal advice. Here's his public key. And people start asking legal questions, and I hypothetically give them good answers to it. And after I've done that for a while, people know from my free giveaway that I give good, reliable legal advice, and I start charging for it. All right? So that's a way in which in any business that's ultimately an information transaction without physical goods moving, you can get around government licensing requirements, which exist, of course, in order to make the people who have the licenses richer by holding down competition. There are other reasons that are offered for them, but I think they are less plausible than that one if you look at the actual history of professional licensing. By doing this. All right, so why won't it happen? And the answer, basically, the second answer, is that governments will do what they can to prevent it. And there is no reliable way in which they can make sure it doesn't happen, but they can make it harder. They can, so far have, I think, prevent Xiaomi digital cash from coming into existence. They can't stop Bitcoin, fortunately. They can try to pressure software companies not to build in reliable features that make it easy to do your public key encryption. But since the encryption doesn't have to be done in Microsoft Word, you can have a third-party program, and third-party program can be written anywhere in the world, and third-party programs are informational stuff, so they can be transmitted anonymously. So one could set up all of this without any permission from any government. It's just going to be tough. I think that covers what I wanted to say. The advantage of taking questions is that when you're answering a question, you can be pretty sure that at least one person in the room is interested in what you're talking about. So I will now start taking questions. Thank you. And if you think I should have talked about another subject, you can blame the people who invited me. I gave lots of alternatives. And if you want to hear me talk about other subjects, I have a web page, and one of the parts of that web page is the kind of recording that's being made at the moment, that is video or audio recordings of talks I have given in various parts of the world on a fair variety of subjects, all of which were interesting to me, and I hope to you. Yes?
Yeah, what's your web page?
www.daviddfriedman.com. Easy to remember. daviddfriedman.com. I also have a blog, but if you get to the web page, there's a link to the blog at the top. The web page, I should say, in addition to my talks, it has links to the full text of several of my books. That basically, I generally web my books if my publisher will let me, because I'm writing books not primarily as a source of income, but primarily as a way of spreading ideas. And I should say, if this were a talk on the death of copyright, which is another thing I sometimes talk about, I would be discussing how you can make a living writing books when you can't enforce copyright because of encryption, et cetera, all of these technologies. I should say, it should be obvious, in the world I'm describing, copyright is unenforceable. It's not very enforceable at present, but it's entirely unenforceable in that world because anybody who wants to can put your information up for sale at a penny on the dollar in an anonymous digital fashion. Yes?
I wanted to connect two concepts that you were talking about. So basically, on the one hand, we have enforcement that's being done through reputation. On the other hand, you mentioned the situation with people who can basically accumulate wealth, not show it, and then leave when they have enough.
Yes.
So if you combine this and somebody is clever enough, you could potentially end up in a situation where somebody builds enough reputation to accumulate enough resources of whatever kind, and then basically when there's enough, if this is a big nonlinear jump, basically, then you just leave.
This is the last move problem, the last period problem.
Exactly.
Yes, that's right. So that no, there are a number. I mean, there are a number of ways in which you can try to gain a reputation market, and one of the things you might want to do is to set up institutions so that people know how many other people are trusting me at the moment. Because if what's going on is that my reputation is earning me $50,000 a year steadily, then it's not very likely it'll be worth blowing it to make an extra $10,000 or $15,000 by not delivering. On the other hand, if I've got a $10,000 reputation, and so I make contracts with 100 different people, each of whom I can cheat for $2,000, and then pull out, that's the problem. So that may mean that you want to set up ways that people are worried about this, such that one person who's making a contract knows how many other people my reputation is already bonded. That would be one way of dealing with that problem. Now another possibility, of course, is that I can resell my reputation. So if my reputation is bringing money and I want to retire, I find, you know, some reliable person, my son or my partner or some friend, and I say, look, let's make a deal. You can be legal online, right? I will give you my private key, or alternatively, I will publish a statement signed with my private key, which says the public key is now such and such. I've changed it, which is something you might also want to do if you're worried about people somehow stealing your private key. And why should I cheat people when I can have that reputation continue to return money in the future? There are real-world examples of high-value markets where reputational enforcement is what's used. The classical piece is an article by Lisa Bernstein discussing the New York diamond market, because it was at one time the case, no longer when she did her study, that the New York diamond industry was dominated by Orthodox Jews, and they did not believe that it was religiously permitted to sue each other. So that meant you had a very trust-intensive industry. You're handing somebody an envelope, a folded piece of paper with $50,000 worth of small diamonds in it, without legal enforcement. They did, however, have trusted arbitrators, mostly rabbis. And if they have trusted arbitrators, that means that when you go into the industry, you gradually build up your reputation. And if you cheat once, you've suddenly blown that reputation. And nowadays, they no longer do it through the rabbis because the industry is wider. They do it through the New York Diamond Dealers Association, Diamond Dealers Exchange, I think it's called. And the result is that they're again using arbitration, and if it turns out you cheated, your name is mud. You're no longer in the industry, and they will let the people in Tel Aviv and in Amsterdam who are in the same industry know about it, and you won't be able to sell your services there. And since this is an industry where your human capital is very valuable, you're very specialized to what you're doing, that's very expensive. So we do actually have examples of high-trust industries that have run this way. But no, there are no perfect solutions to any problem. That's perfectly true. Yes?
You're talking about how to maintain reputations
Yes.
online.
Yes.
And I'm just thinking, in the real world, you have bad reputations and you have good reputations.
Yes.
So if you're dealing with someone and you don't pay them, or you go to a store and steal something, they put your photo on the wall,
Yes.
so people know that they can
Yes.
trust you. I'm thinking online, you're more likely to have people with good reputation and people with no reputation.
Yes.
Because if your net reputation is negative, you're likely
throw it away.
to create a new
You burn your
identity.
identity.
Yeah.
Yes. You can do that with a corporation too.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Yeah.
And do you think that will make a significant difference? Will no identity be the new bad identity, or do you think it's fixable somehow?
I'm not sure I see the problem there. That is to say, it is clear that if I cheat you once, I can throw away my identity. But that means that people don't give me an opportunity to cheat you for any significant amount until I have a reputation that's worth something. And then there's a not very good science fiction novel, I don't remember the name of it, but which is partly deliberately dealing with these circumstances. And he's got a character who has two reputations. One of them is a good reputation in this sense, and the other is the reputation of somebody who does illegal things. And he's got a contract with his good reputation, I think to write a program or something. And he's thinking about the fact that it'd be easier to just collect the money and don't do it. But he then says, no, because my good reputation is the only reason I got this contract. If you get me other contracts in the future, I got to keep that one good and do my bad things on the other reputations. So I think that doesn't strike me as a very, very serious problem. But nothing is perfect. One of the lines that one of the cypherpunks made a long time ago is, encryption is not your friend. It's not your friend, it's not your enemy. Guns are not your friend, right? When someone is trying to kill you and you have a gun is your friend. When someone's trying to kill you and he has the gun is not your friend. So, but also, I'm not making predictions. I have a whole book, Future Imperfect, one chapter which deals with this stuff, which is about technological revolutions that might happen that would change the world. And that's a fairly short time period, with the exception of one chapter of only going about 30 years out. And they're all might. I think the main lesson I got writing that book is that the future is more uncertain than people usually assume. That most people assume things will be about the same 30 years from now as they are now. And I think that's extraordinarily unlikely. But how they will be different, I can't tell you. With luck, 30 years from now, I will have a 40-year-old body, and it's never going to get any older. Maybe take it down to 30. That's an optimistic one, but it's not impossible. My guess is that most of the people in this room won't die of old age. Not because we'll have a thermonuclear war and they'll kill you another way, but because most of you are young enough so that my guess is that the lethal disease that is killing all of us, which is called aging, they will have a cure for by then. I'm older than most of you, so I'm not at all confident I'm going to be able to. I think there's at least some small chance that anyway, that was a digression, hopefully interesting. So this may or may not happen, but is at least one of the possible futures, and I think interesting. Questions? Yes?
About the plan to keep it this way, you could do this, you could have done this for 15, 20 years ago, sending instructions on how you would kill someone and then saying to the world, I can kill anyone. But has anyone done this? Or?
Well, as I said, that they haven't. The ransomware is a case of a real-world crime that took advantage of some of these technologies. I am not aware, at least, that there are hitmen who are available for hire online, because it does depend on a world where most of your potential customers know how to deal with public key encryption. Once they're told this is the public key, can use it, and things of that sort.
I did see that on the web page for assassination markets,
Yes.
there was a link to a web page which you should visit, where they said that we kill people for money, but I haven't heard that is
Yeah, but the assassination politics was a slightly nutty libertarian who had this interesting idea that one way of constraining governments would be if it was easy to kill politicians you thought were doing bad things. And for some reason, that idea got him into trouble. Yes?
Yes. I wonder about what is the last resort?
What is what?
If I lose my cell phone, if I lose my credit card, if I lose my identity card,
Yes.
there's a mechanism how to get it back.
Yes.
Usually it's enforced by the government.
Yes.
But when you come to the private key and to your Bitcoin and so on, I know, for example, in this room, tens of thousands of dollars have been lost in Bitcoin because someone loses the password.
Yes.
What's the mechanism to make sure we can get the private key and the Bitcoin address, for example, back?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess the obvious answer is, again, there are no perfect solutions. If you're careless enough, you lose stuff. That's always been the case. But your private key is just one long number. And there ought to be quite a lot of ways in which you can store one long number that make it easy for you to get it back and hard for other people to get it. So, for example, you can have it encrypted using a passphrase, which you have memorized. And you can have that in several places. And as long as the passphrase is long and very, very hard to guess, and you have to allow for the fact that computers are very patient, so they can try a lot of guesses, that's a way of doing it. You don't want to have it written on a piece of tape on the bottom of your keyboard, though, because somebody else might get into the office one of these days. At present, as far as I can tell, an awful lot of getting it through people's security depends on what's, I think, referred to as human engineering. It depends on fooling people and giving away their secrets, rather than on fancy high-tech things. But no, I would suggest that if you have a private key, it should be more than one place. I tell my kids redundancy is your friend. That's why, in addition to having this paper on 2 sheets of paper over there, it is also on my cell phone, the talk I just gave you, just in case. So you need redundancy. There's really have 2 problems. You have to make sure you don't lose it. You have to make sure nobody else can steal it. And if someone else steals it, you may be able to protect yourself, as long as you've still got a copy, by immediately putting up a public notice signed with that private key saying this key is no longer secure. But beyond that, you've just lost your reputation, but at least other people can't use it to cheat people. And preventing people from stealing it means that either you've got it in the extreme case, a slip of paper in your wallet that never leaves your wallet except when you've got to type it into something. You've got to make sure if you're typing into a computer, it's not a computer that isn't logging your keystrokes for somebody else to use. There are a variety of precautions you can take. You could do it in hardware. You could have essentially a piece of silicon, which was a very simple computer, whose only function was encrypting and decrypting using your private key. And you just make sure you never lose that. There are lots of different ways that ingenious people can do this. And certainly any real-world version of what I described is going to be a lot more complicated than what I'm saying, because that's the way things are. Similarly, there's a science fiction short story some of you may have read by Werner Vinge called The Ungoverned. And it's describing the anarcho-capitalist society that I sketched in Machinery of Freedom in a science fiction story. But it's a whole lot richer description than my description was, because it's a description by a novelist, quite a good novelist, not by an academic. And similarly, this world as it actually exists is going to be lots more complicated than what I've said. And a good deal of it already exists, I should say. I'm giving you the extreme version, but after all, eBay already has mechanisms for reputation enforcement. They've had them for years, that when you do a transaction on eBay, if I buy something on eBay, I can tell eBay the guy cheated me, and unless we used a middleman, I can't get my money back. But anybody else who wants to deal with that person on eBay is going to find out that some percentage of the people he dealt with were unhappy. And I actually had a much simpler case of that a year or 2 ago. I bought a large external battery for recharging my laptop. And I bought it mainly for long airplane flights. I bought it from a country where the maker was in China. And I emailed them that I was concerned about whether there were problems with using this on an airplane. I don't remember the context in which I asked them was not identical to the context in which the problem arose, but it was closely related. And they said there wasn't any problem. And I then flew, I think it was flying into Shanghai, there was no problem, and flying out of Shanghai was confiscated. Because the Chinese airlines have a maximum capacity for batteries, the lithium batteries, because lithium batteries are something of a risk. And if there's too much power in it and it breaks down, the sort of thing that happened with the Samsung Note that you probably all heard the story about, you can get an unpleasant fire. So it's not an unreasonable restriction. I lost a fairly expensive battery. I wrote a very annoyed email to the manufacturer. I thought the fact that they were in China and therefore ought to know by their own country's restrictions on their industry made it worse. They were rather apologetic. I put up a review on Amazon of their product describing what had happened, and they generously offered to replace what I had lost, but would I mind changing the review? Which I did after they replaced it. It's still not very useful, because at this point, not just China, but everybody has limits on lithium batteries that big, unfortunately. So I can use it for non-airline purposes, for which it's sometimes useful to be able to recharge your battery, your laptop without a power cord. But at this, when I flew across from the U.S., I had 2 laptops with me, just in case I ran out. Turned out I didn't need that, but that was redundancy again. All right. More questions? Yes.
I was thinking about protection from fraud online. We study law markets where they sell drugs and similar stuff. There are lots of examples of sellers that perform exit scams. They have a good reputation years, then they excite stuff and just pocket money. But the main issue there is a human issue, because the problem is solved by escrow services, and people are too cheap to use them. But if you follow all the rules, you should not.
eBay does that as well. Yeah, there are a number of mechanisms. There are more mechanisms I could describe. Let me describe how we could use the reputational mechanism with the signed contracts for parties who don't have reputation. All we require is that the arbitrator has reputation. So when we sign the contract, I write the program, you deposit $10,000 with the arbitrator. If the arbitrator finds that you didn't pay me for the program, he sends me the $10,000, or he keeps the $10,000. Either way, he confiscates it. So you can post a bond instead of a reputation, as long as there's somebody who can be trusted. The escrow agency in your case has to be. And eBay, in fact, does have mechanisms for dealing through escrow. So if you're buying an expensive painting, let's say, and the question is it a fake, you can arrange to have it sent to someone who will hold it. After you approve it, they release it to you and release the money the other direction. So, yeah, those are all mechanisms. But of course, the people who are committing fraud will also be ingenious.
Yeah, and people are cheap and just want stuff fast.
And people make mistakes.
Yeah.
That's right. I talk about it in terms of the FBI can't know what you're saying.
Yeah.
But that depends on you're not being careless. Sometimes we are careless. Other questions? Yes, back there.
Yes, I would like to ask a question about the digital currencies.
Yes.
And do you believe that there is a problem with the current digital currencies not being backed by anything? For instance, because you can always create an infinite number of digital currencies, but you can create an infinite number of, say, silver or gold that would back the digital currencies that would be exchanged online. What would you say about that?
I'm not sure I understand the problem. The fact that they don't have backing is the reason governments can't stop them, because you don't have to have a trusted bank holding the backing. So, in the case of Bitcoin, what's preventing expanding it is laws of mathematics, such that it is very hard to do the mathematical process that's needed to mint another Bitcoin. And you could imagine other versions of that. You could have had a Bitcoin which started out with a fixed number of units and wasn't expandable, presumably. I'm not sure I understand what you're saying. The problem is that.
Well, my problem is that since all currencies are based on trust, for instance, Bitcoin or
It's not quite true. A gold coin really isn't based on trust.
Well, it's been around for 5,000 years.
No, but if I'm using actual physical gold and silver as money,
yeah,
it depends on my opinion that those commodities will maintain their value.
yeah.
But it doesn't depend on my trusting anybody as long as I can weigh the coin and check that it's really gold.
Yeah.
Gold has the useful characteristic that it's the densest of all metals you're going to encounter, because people are unlikely to use depleted uranium for coins. And therefore, it is relatively easy to check that gold is really gold. All you've got to do is to measure its density. So that's the case where there's almost no trust involved at all. But currency requires that you trust the issuer. That's right. And you know, if this were a different talk, I could discuss how I think free market money ought to work, which would be a fractional reserve currency using a commodity bundle rather than a single commodity. And if eventually something like Xiaomi digital cash becomes possible, we can go back to using that system. But as long as we don't have trusted issuers as long as trusted issuers can only operate in places where government can stop them, we're not going to. Yes?
So the topic that you just touched with fractional reserve banking, that's I know it's a hot potato in libertarian circles, and we do have quite a lot of time, so it would be interesting if you would expand your views.
Sure. The only reason it's a hot potato is that Murray Rothbard took an indefensible position, and his followers stuck with that position. Ayn Rand did similar things. But no, the nominal argument against fractional reserve currency is that it's fraud, because if I've got currency out for 100,000 ounces of gold and I only have 10,000 ounces of gold in my safe, if everybody comes in, I can't get paid off. But of course, the way you handle that, the way real systems did handle that, is I have 10,000 ounces of gold in my safe, and I have other assets that are worth much more than 90,000 assets, than 90,000 assets, land, bonds, whatever it is. So the result is that if people decide there's a run on my bank, some people come in and they want to redeem 1,000 ounces. I say, here's 1,000 ounces. I'll take your 1,000 ounces currency. I will go out on the market and buy another 1,000 ounces of gold using my non-gold resources. I'll sell some of them, and I'll keep doing that. And if the only problem is one of timing, this problem was solved in the 18th century because the Scottish private banks, which were fractional reserve banks based on silver, some of them had notes with what was called the option clause, and the option clause essentially says 1 ounce of silver deliverable on demand, or if we can't deliver it on demand, we'll deliver it 6 months later with 5% interest. So that's a way in which you are reasonably safe against it. Now, it's true that it is risky to have a bank that can barely cover its liabilities, because if you have a bank which is issued 100,000 ounces worth of notes, and it has 10,000 ounces of gold and 91,000 ounces worth of other assets, if the price of gold goes up, it's in trouble, because its assets don't go up and its liabilities do. So that means that if you have an issuer of that sort, you would like it to have large excess assets. And the 18th century Scottish solution was that the banks were unlimited liability partnerships, and at least one of the partners was wealthy. So therefore, if the bank ran out of money, his private assets became the backing for the bank. So other than that, I can tell you my theory, but I cannot prove it is true about why Rothbard held that opinion. And my theory is that in his version of macroeconomics, fractional reserve banking was one of the reasons you had things like depressions. Because he is a libertarian, he couldn't claim it should be illegal. He wanted to claim that in a good libertarian society there would be no depressions. And in a good libertarian society, people would be allowed to do anything that wasn't force or fraud. Since his theory required him to have some way of stopping fractional reserve banks, that meant he had to claim they were fraud. That's my interpretation. It is doubtless a prejudiced interpretation. I cannot say that I ever put that question to Murray to see if I was correctly interpreting it, and I think he would have said no in any case. Might even have believed no. We aren't all perfectly informed about our own motives. But that's my explanation, because I can't see otherwise. It's a sort of a silly position, because nobody's going to argue that every insurance company is a fraud, but everyone knows that an insurance company could face circumstances in which all the houses they insured burned down and they went bankrupt. Yeah.
I believe Jesus or something.
Yes.
He wrote a book which is a long title about business cycle theory, and he said that in the ancient Greek they had something similar like fractional reserve banking, but without the Scottish laws, much more primitive. And according to some legal jurists at the time, they considered it to be fraud when they used fractional reserve banking and they couldn't pay it back.
Yeah.
So there.
Haven't read that book.
No.
And I'd be a little, I don't know, I'd be a little surprised to see that in ancient Greece, given the institutions. I think of this as a later development than that, but I really don't know. But, other questions? Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but aren't most encryption methods, excluding one-time pads, not proven mathematically to be unbreakable? Doesn't that, in combination?
Well, one-time pads, as far as I know, the only encryption method that is in principle unbreakable.
Yeah.
All the other ones is that breaking them costs you more in time and computer resources than anybody has. That's right.
But doesn't that, right, so that it's sure that it's always costs more in computer resources than anything else.
But I believe it has been the case, at least in the past, that if you lengthen the key you use, the time to decrypt goes up faster than the time to encrypt.
I mean, that's if we're brute forcing it, but
Yeah.
it's not sure that there aren't other mathematical methods.
That's correct. That's correct. You may know there's a famous story about Fermat. People know about Fermat's last theorem, which most people think he was a mistake. But apparently there is a known incident where somebody mailed Fermat saying, "This is a long number. Do you know if it's a prime?" And Fermat mailed back, its two prime factors are. And I gather, at least as I read the story, there is no known way in which, with the resources he had, he could have done it. So that raises the possibility that maybe there are things in number theory we haven't discovered, which will let people figure out. But I gather, and again, I'm not a mathematician who deals with this stuff, so I'm a layman on this. But my understanding is that there are a number of different mechanisms that can be used to generate public key, private key pairs. And the particular one that's currently used hinges on the fact that factoring is hard, and that therefore you can create a very long prime much more easily than you can factor a very long non-prime, essentially. And if that stops being true, then the world is going to have to shift. But the only real danger is that it stops being true by surprise. That as long as it goes the way things usually go in mathematics and technology, which is first you can barely do it, then you can do it if you try, then anybody can do it. On that pattern, once it becomes clear you can barely do it, all prudent people switch to a different method, post using the old method, this is my new method, and then burn the old method, so to speak. So yeah, no, it's possible that all of this will blow away when somebody makes a breakthrough, but so far not.
Yeah, but that breakthrough is close, because if you do with quantum computers, factoring becomes easy. And then you can track everything. If you just store the transactions, you can track it.
What you're saying is that in deciding on the length of key you use, you have to figure out how long you have to keep the secret. That if you use a key which today requires 100,000 years of processing, you want to worry that in 20 years that might be 15 minutes.
Yeah.
That's right. That's certainly one of the considerations for doing it. But most of us aren't, well, if we solve the aging problem, maybe we'll start worrying about this more. But at the moment, most of us don't have secrets that we need to keep for a century. Yes?
Yeah. Is it necessarily a bad thing to be able to off somebody easily, anonymously? Speaking in terms of how you behave, speaking in terms of incentives, socially further behavior. So
the problem is you only have to offend one person in order for that to happen. And that is, the answer is my instinct is a bad thing, but I haven't really thought about it carefully enough to figure out whether there are balancing benefits that I'm not sufficiently allowing for. Obviously, the guy who wrote the assassination politics stuff thought it was a good thing. Yeah.
Regarding crypto and the ransomware last week, they actually broke it on Windows XP machines.
They what?
They actually broke the crypto because they found the prime keys they used to.
So they can, by they, you mean they can decrypt the stuff?
Expert
succeeded in decrypting what they did?
Yes, because they had too low entropy.
They had what?
Too low entropy.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So we were able to find the prime number.
See, that was very foolish of them.
Yeah. The machines, over the machines, the lower processing power is created the prime number.
So the bad guys make mistakes too sometimes.
Yeah.
That's good. Yes. Yes.
I'm cheating a bit because I talked to you earlier about this topic, but you mentioned very briefly about that in this situation the role of the state would essentially change from being what we currently see as a state to being a landlord, because obviously there would be virtually no income to tax, and hence their profit would have to derive from land use. And also you mentioned, you wrote this paper about the sizes of nations.
Yes.
My gut feeling is that wouldn't the equilibrium size of a nation be much smaller?
I think so.
So that would be a very big move towards anarchy in any case.
Also, yes, that's right. I've argued that the Amish are anarchists. I don't know how much people know about the Amish. They're a religious sect in America, very interesting one. And the Amish, they're just very rule-oriented anarchists. It's sort of odd to call somebody an anarchist who isn't allowed to drive an automobile. But the Amish system, the rules that apply to an individual Amish are specific to his congregation. And an Amish congregation is 25 to 40 families. And the reason it's that small is the Amish don't build churches or meeting houses. And therefore, the whole congregation has to be able to fit in a barn or a large farmhouse for their services. And when a congregation gets bigger than that, they split. Furthermore, a Amish is only obliged to obey the rules of his congregation when as an adult he promises to do so. So it really is a real social contract in that sense. That as a child, your parents may have various forms of control over you, but you are not violating the Amish rules if, as a 12-year-old, you, or say a 16-year-old who hasn't sworn yet, if you drive a car. And so in a sense, they're anarchists. That is, they've got many tiny states. You can choose among them to some degree, with some difficulty according to where you're living. There are some other ways in which they're anarchists as well, because of course their enforcement mechanism is ultimately ostracism, and choosing not to associate with somebody is neither force nor fraud. So that's an example where you've got something like that in the real world. I should say, for people who are interested in this sort of stuff, my project of recent years has been a book whose current title is Legal Systems Very Different from Ours. And I taught a course on that topic every other year for quite a while at the law school. I started teaching that course as a commitment mechanism, that I had written 2 articles well before that, one on Saga period Iceland and one on 18th century England, each of which described a weird legal system and tried to make sense of it. I learned a lot of stuff doing that and had a lot of fun, and I've been lazy for a decade or so. So I decided I needed a way to tie my hands to make sure I would do some more research. So I announced a seminar on legal systems very different from ours, and once I announced it, I had to learn enough stuff to teach the seminar. So that ends up as a book. It hasn't been published yet. I just sent it off to my agent a couple of weeks ago to look for a publisher, but the draft is up on my webpage if people want to. And it's a lot of fun. That one of the talks I didn't give here is my talk on feud law, which comes out of making sense of not only Saga period Iceland, but northern Somalia and a number of other systems, and concluding that when I described anarcho-capitalism and machinery of freedom, I was really reinventing the wheel, because that was a modern technology, modern developed society variant of a kind of legal system that has existed repeatedly through history. So if you're interested in that stuff, read it on the webpage. You can read my blog, which is whatever I feel like talking about at the moment. You can read a good many other books for free, and others you have to pay for, but most of them not very much. Other questions? Way at the back.
Okay. What about the trend with mass surveillance, counteracting the
Yeah.
away?
Yeah, I have a chapter on surveillance too. Yes. This is basically David Brin's book, Open Society, I think. I'm not sure I got the name right, but the argument is that one of the other technologies that's happening is the combination of at least 3 technologies. One of them is surveillance technology, one of them is databases, and one of them is face recognition software. because that means that if there are enough video cameras on enough poles around the world, everything that happens in a public place is not only recorded, but searchable and findable. And as the technology gets better and better, the definition of public space could expand to cover pretty much every place, because once you've got video cameras with the size and the aerodynamic characteristics of a mosquito, it's hard to keep them out. And so I have a chapter discussing that world. That's a different, one of my future imperfect worlds. And you can imagine combining that with the strong privacy world. And then the critical question is, can you control the interface between cyberspace and real space? That it does no good to be sending strongly encrypted messages if there's a video mosquito watching you type. So you need some way of connecting to cyberspace, which might be a brain-to-machine link. It might be as simple as typing under a hood. You can imagine a variety of other versions. But it goes in both directions. Because if you have good enough strong privacy, you might be able to avoid the problem of surveillance. Because when I talk to you, we don't do this by this primitive method of vibrating air to affect the things in our ear. My talking is all done inside my head. It's then transmitted in an encrypted channel to you by Bluetooth. The decryption is happening inside your head, so we don't really care what the mics and the video cameras are watching. And when I do anything illegal, it happens online as well, so we don't care what they watch. So, yeah, there are all sorts of interesting possible futures out there, and most of you are going to see some of the ones that happen. Yes?
You talked about governments wanting to stop all this and stuff.
Yes.
Realistically, what do you think? Are they ahead of the game, or are they ahead of the game?
I don't know. The National Security Agency probably. I like to claim that that the reason for a bunch of things NSA did was that they read my article on strong privacy and decided to stop it. But my guess is that they had written the article before I wrote it, because they were the people who were specializing in encryption and that kind of stuff. On the other hand, we live in a multiple nations world. And that means that in order to block something, you need to have all the important countries do it, not just one country. And to some degree, powerful countries can put pressure on other countries, but not unlimited degree. One of the reasons I'm happy that China is developing the way it is that it's a country different enough from the U.S., so it will try to suppress different things, and powerful enough so the U.S. can't push it around. And the more such countries there are, the harder it is to block technological progress. But again, there's a downside to that, because some of the technological progress is bad, right? I mean, we can think of technologies. I gave it, after I published Future Imperfect, I gave a talk about it at Google. And I started out by saying that I thought global warming was a pretty wimpy catastrophe. That, the temperature of the world goes up a few degrees in 100 years. I got 3 different ways of wiping out the human race faster than that. And I do. And they all involve technological developments that could happen and could go in a perverse direction, or could go in a positive direction. Yes?
Well, one of the big issues with blockchain technology and PGP encryption is that with the advancement of quantum computers, a government could actually decrypt all this information in just 5 years from now.
Yes.
China has their quantum computer that in 2 years is going to be faster than the world's fastest supercomputer. By 2025, they might actually be able to decrypt, 256-bit encryption.
In that case, I would suggest, if you believe that's the case, that you not use encryption to protect information, that you will be much worse off if they discover it in 2025. I mean, that's all you can do. And try to pay attention to the technology so that if it's going to happen in 10 years, you know what precautions you have to take. Yeah, no, it's a very uncertain world, and the natural instinct of people is to be conservative. That is, from my standpoint, the fundamental mistake being made by people who think they can stop global warming is assuming that stasis is an option. That we've got because if stasis was an option, it's got an attraction. We know the world as it is. It's got its problems, but it's a pretty nice world. And so I can certainly see people saying, let's just stop this train, I want to get off. And the train doesn't have brakes. So I think the sensible thing with regard to global warming is not to try to stop it, but to try to say if it's happening, how do you adapt to it, what precautions do you take, how do you adjust it. The Dutch should raise their dikes a little bit higher, and you should maybe make your investments in slightly cooler places than you were making them before, things like that. But you've got a reasonable chance of doing that, and I think the practicality of preventing, and even aside from the fact that I don't know if climate change is a bad thing, it's probably a good thing for Sweden, for example. My theory, by the way, about why Putin doesn't believe in global warming is that Putin does believe in global warming, and he's looked at the map. But in any case, so I think the sensible thing to do is to say you're going to live in a world that changes a lot, and try to pay attention and try to figure out where you can benefit by the change and where you can minimize the amount by which you're worse to the change, and so on. Questions? Yes?
I'm thinking about how afraid are you of traces of your real life you and the digital you?
Of the what?
Of the digital copy of your digital identity and your real identity. Just for example, if you write some legal advice on legal online, and then they will compare it to Machine of Freedom, and see, okay, this is the same author.
I understand that.
And he has been cheating, hasn't been taking steps.
Yes, that's right. That one of the things that you may know that happens online, that a good deal of the stuff I'm talking about is happening in a much weaker form just through social norms. That a large fraction of the friends my daughter has are people she's never met. And within that set of people, it is rude to ask people questions about their real life stuff. You may volunteer such information to somebody you trust, but the social norm is a norm of anonymity, essentially. That you have friends in World of Warcraft, you know their World of Warcraft names, you very likely don't know their real names. And one of the things that happens online is that you get somebody commenting on blogs, and he's commenting on blogs under multiple names, but sometimes you know who it is. My favorite blog, which is called Slate Star Codex, which I recommend to everybody if you like reading interesting stuff online and arguing with simple people online, because it's got a wide variety of commenters, and most of them are pretty nice people. And there's one guy there who, in theory, is banned from the blog, but in fact he just keeps changing his name and reposting. And every time he does it, everybody else reading it, like after the second post, says, "We know who that is." And I presume the guy running the blog did something that's worth the trouble to try to keep banning him. That's an extreme case. It's got a very odd posting style. But certainly with computers, if you're clever enough, you could do better than that. So you're right that if I were doing it and were seriously worried about punishment, I would want to take precautions. I would want to write out my instructions and then have my assistant, who I trust, rewrite it so it wasn't my writing stuff. Or maybe, I wonder how soon we'll have software that will let you obscure that. That is software such that I can write something and then put it through the software to change it. See, I've actually been engaged in some research along these lines very recently, because the last time that I taught legal systems, my legal systems class, which was this last semester, most of my students were Saudi LLM students. And unfortunately, a good many of them not only have not very good English or had a hard time writing a paper, but also have rather limited moral compunctions about getting somebody else to write a paper for them. And so I was doing research in which I was doing Google searches on text strings from the paper, and found that 6 of them were in fact on a website. Some of them there may have been an innocent explanation, so that these people didn't all fail, only some of them did, the ones where there wasn't an innocent explanation. So that's really the same process in a much more primitive version, which you can do by hand, where you can identify things. Yeah, that would be a legitimate issue. Other questions? Yes?
In a way, this privacy thing on the internet must be some kind of, it must be run by a couple of companies.
By what?
It must be run by some sort of company, because we're not going to have government run.
You don't have a company run it.
No, but the institutional competing, how is it going to work out when maybe a company says, we're not going to share information with your users because we want to monopolize this?
I'm not sure I understand who is doing this. That is, In order for this to work, all I have to do is have some way of publicizing my public key. Well, I can publicize my public key through anybody. It's not like there's anybody who has a monopoly of publicizing public keys. Once the software is out there for, that is the encryption algorithm is public knowledge. This is going to be open source software probably. So I'm not quite sure how any single firm is in a position to gain this. I mean, it's hard enough for governments to gain this, and they already have monopolies. Maybe I'm missing something.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe I'm missing.
Yep. Other questions? Yes.
It's going to be a bit of a hypothetical. I've heard you say several times that the main disagreement between you and your father was that you thought the institutions you proposed would probably work but might not, and he thought they probably wouldn't but might.
Yes.
I would say that already the last 10 or so years have given plenty of evidence, not evidence, but evidence in the direction that they indeed might, because we've seen versions of them online. So would you think he would be closer to your position having seen that evidence?
Probably. I think in some areas he moved closer, that he eventually decided that drugs should be legal, for example, which wasn't his initial position. But I would also say that I have evidence now from history, because I now know of societies using a very primitive version of this sort of thing, which did function for long periods of time, and had problems. I mean, Saga period Iceland eventually breaks down. It breaks down possibly because the enforcement mechanisms become less competitive, that you end up with something that I've argued in machinery, that one of the failure modes of anarcho-capitalism is if the number of rights enforcement agencies is very small, you can then get a cartel to reestablish it. And I think one can interpret the Sturlund period breakdown of Saga period Iceland, the last 50 years before they turned the country over to the King of Norway, as just that pattern. That you started out with a system where there were roughly 40 Godar, 40 people through whom you could plug into the legal system, which are very, very loosely the equivalent by rights enforcement agencies, but not a very close equivalent. And you ended up with a situation where in a region of Iceland, all of the Godar belonged to one family. Now, you've still got some competition because then the family would start fighting itself. The reason it's called the Sturlund period is the Sturlund family had a good deal of the late Sturlund period violence as one Sturlund against another. But nonetheless, eventually the system did collapse. So that's a possible failure mode. Right? And I just don't think we know enough to predict these things. And my guess is that if we did know enough, the answer would be under some environments it'll be stable and some it won't. That when this book on legal systems, one of the questions people keep asking me is, what's the best legal system? The answer is, I doubt there is one. That what I'm trying to do is not to figure out what the best legal system is, but to look at a whole lot of different legal systems that are very different, that have existed, and try to understand them. How did they work? What problems did they raise? What made them work or not work? And that kind of stuff. And that's as far as I'm willing to claim to go. The basic assumption that that book is based on is that all human societies face about the same problems, that they solve them in an interesting variety of different ways, and that they're all grown-ups. And that therefore you shouldn't say the only reason why the people in Pericles and Athens did it this way was because they were stupid. Because they weren't stupid. And the people in Imperial China weren't stupid. That's a legal system that lasted for 2,000 years, with intervals of break. But basically, the law code of the last Chinese dynasty, I think the opinion is that a majority of it was copied from the law code of a Chinese dynasty 1,000 years earlier. Right? So it may or may not have been a good system, but it at least was one thing that worked, and you could make sense of it and try to understand it. Trying to do this for a whole bunch of different ones. And some of them are pretty anarchist, and some of them are very far from anarchist. Sometimes the same issues show that some of them are based on religion. And I argue that the issues that arise with Jewish law and Islamic law are a lot like the issues that arise with American constitutional law, because even though we don't claim the Constitution was written by God, we in a sense treat it as if it was. And the result is that it's really hard to change it, but it's not so hard to interpret it. And the way I usually put it is that by the standards of the rabbis, every Supreme Court justice in history was a strict constructionist. because Jewish law and the law in the Jewish scriptures differ in quite a large number of ways. Other questions? Yes.
So your position there with in respect to the laws, you want to have the diversity, or understand the diversity. Is that so that you can perhaps adapt it to
one of the things I'm doing is saying, are there ideas we could steal? And let me give you a small example, but in a way it parallels the argument of machinery of freedom. The argument, in a sense, the central argument of machinery of freedom, I think, is I have a mechanism for generating good law. That everybody else says, I'll decide what good law is, and then imagine a society that does it. And that's what Rothbard's really doing. That's what everybody else has done. What I'm doing is, this is a market institution in which the people generating law will make more money if they do a good job. And I have a somewhat analogous case coming out of 18th century English criminal law. Because the problem I want to solve there is, how do you make it in people's interest to convict guilty people and not innocent people? And that's one of the big problems in any legal system. And the way we all try to do it is by having trial rules that make it hard to convict innocent people. And that works so-so. We don't know how well it works. But there is a different way. And that is that in 18th century England, there were no police and there were essentially no public prosecutors. You had a legal system that on paper was our system, but in which prosecution of crime was private, usually by the victim. And there are the reason that's a puzzling situation is, why does anybody bother? See, after all, our tort system is privately prosecuted, right? When somebody dents your car, you call up a lawyer. But your tort system, if you win, he pays you damages. Criminal law in 18th century England, if you win, they hang him. Or maybe they pardon him, or maybe they pardon him and he'll agree to enlist in the army. There are a variety of options. It was less bloody than it looks on paper, it turns out. But why do you do it? One of the reasons is you want the reputation that if people rob you, they hang. If you're a firm that's likely to be a repeat customer, that's likely to be robbed many times, it pays to prosecute the first guy so as to discourage the less. It only pays if you get the right guy. If the incentive to prosecute, to convict somebody is a reward, if you grab the first homeless idiot who passes your front door and can somehow get him framed, you get the reward. But if that's what you do when they steal your property, the guy who steals your property says, this is a safe guy to steal from, and I'll tell my friends too, right? So one of the neat things about private prosecution for private deterrence, this is treating deterrence as a private good rather than a public good, is that it actually gives you an incentive to get the right guy. So that's one of the kind of interesting insights that comes in looking at these systems. And I should say, the 18th century English, as I interpret it, had institutions designed to make deterrence a private good. Because suppose you're not a repeat player. Suppose you're somebody who might be the target of robbery once every 15 years. You want people to believe you'll prosecute them. But once somebody actually robs you, you realize that the cost of prosecuting is more than the benefit's worth. They have a solution to that. They had what were called associations for the prosecution of felons. And this is a group of people, usually in one town, who pay an annual fee to a pool of money which will pay the cost of prosecuting anybody who commits a felony against them. And the final stage of the process is the list of members is published in the local newspaper for the felons to read. So it's a way of pre-committing. So you paid in advance, and the people know they should rob somebody else. All right. So that's sort of an elegant thing which I got out of reading about 18th century English law. And I originally got interested for entirely different reasons, but then I discovered it was an interesting system. So that's one of my longest chapters, as it turns out. Other questions? All right. Yes?
Slightly different topic, but unschooling children.
Yes.
How did you come up with the idea, and how did you decide what books to give your kids?
Yes. I should say, I have one son by my first marriage who was reared mostly by his mother, although he spent summers with us, and was schooled conventionally. And I have two children by my current marriage, which has been going for about 30 years by now, I guess. And they were first unschooled in a small private, unconventional private school, and then home unschooled. And the private school was modeled on the Sudbury Valley School, which is a famous unschooling school. And the Sudbury Valley School is really based on two principles, freedom and democracy, and I'm in favor of freedom. And the school we were in, the system as I interpreted it, broke down eventually because of the internal politics of the school, which is why we shifted to home schooling. But basically, it seemed to me that the standard model for education doesn't make a whole lot of sense. That kids learn stuff a whole lot more with the stuff they want to learn. You know, there may be occasionally situations where you really have to learn something that's really boring, but mostly kids tend to get interested in stuff. And, you know, the same kid who has no interest at all in the American history they're making him learn may be able to tell you a whole lot about the history of Azeroth if he happens to be a World of Warcraft player. You observe that in a lot of different contexts. So it looked to me like a good idea. And it initially arose with our daughter, Rebecca, same one who went with India to me 20 years later. And she was we were living in Chicago when she was born, and she went to a Montessori preschool that she was fairly happy with. We then moved to California, and there was a Montessori school run by a Christian church. My wife's a Christian, I'm not, but that didn't really matter very much. And she went to that for a little while. And my wife thought that Rebecca was ready to learn to read, and the people at the school didn't. And so my wife asked Rebecca if she'd like to learn to read. She said yes. And I think it took about 2 weeks. And largely using Dr. Seuss, by the way. Dr. Seuss, as you may know, is the author of some wonderful how to learn to read books, even though they're not labeled that way, because they're designed for that purpose. One of them, unfortunately, is called Hop on Pop, so it's a subversive tract, but it's well designed for learning to read. So that encouraged us. And my wife's a geologist, and she was listening to a class at the school, and the teacher was incorrectly describing the history of plant life on Earth. Had grass spreading across the Earth, some hundreds of billions of years before grass existed. And my wife pointed this out to the teacher at some point, and the teacher wasn't interested. And we felt that you ought to, if you're going to be taught things by people, you ought to be taught things by people who care whether what they tell you is true or not. So that was an incentive. We had heard about this experimental, unconventional school, so we asked Becca if she'd like to try it. She said yes. And she and then her brother went to that school for a while, and then things ran into trouble, and so we switched to doing it at home. California, in effect, has entirely unregulated homeschooling by accident. That you basically, the way the rules are made, you announce that your home is a school, you fill out a form, you are supposed to keep records that nobody will ever ask you for, and that's it. And we were happy with the result, with how our kids turned out. I should say, the only thing that we, in some sense, forced them to learn was the multiplication table. And we did that by bullying, essentially, we were driving along, what's 3 times 4? And Rebecca's opinion was that wasn't worth learning. She thinks that was a mistake. But on the whole, it worked out pretty well, and we ended up with kids who were very well educated in the things they were interested in, and not so well educated in other things. But they wanted to go to a good college, so for a year or two before the point where they were taking their SAT exams, they learned stuff they would need for the SAT exams that they hadn't learned because it was fun, which was mostly math. The English stuff they could get essentially perfect scores without studying, because that was the stuff they liked and had done. I should say, Rebecca was 5 when Betty taught her to read. Bill was 2, watched the process and taught himself. I then had the problem of what to recommend to read to a 5 or 6-year-old with more or less adult reading abilities and 6-year-old taste. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Edgar Rice Burroughs' Mars stories, but they are very well designed for that market because they are written with adult prose, and they're a lot of fun, but they don't worry a whole lot about plausibility. And they're exciting and dramatic and melodramatic and so forth. So I think we were happy with the result. On the other hand, my grandchildren are not being home unschooled, and basically both Patri and his fiancée about to become wife. Patri's first marriage ended a couple of years ago. He's been living with a wonderful lady who's been the effective mother of my grandchildren and doing a brilliant job of it, and they're supposed to get married sometime They're currently saying not until February. I keep telling them that marriage is more important than weddings, but they want to have a nice wedding, and there are various timing constraints on doing it. So I'm going to get some more grandchildren pretty clearly, and maybe at some point I'll persuade them to unschool. But at this point, the basic, I think the main consistence is that neither of them has time to do it.
Just so you
Yes.
know, so if we here, we don't have that option, but you can't homeschool in Sweden, it's not allowed.
Yes. That's unfortunate.
I'm just saying.
You can move to California.
No.
You can obviously do a lot of unschooling along with, I mean, after all, I went to not really an ordinary school, but a good private school run by the University of Chicago, but an awful lot of my education happened elsewhere. I mean, as I like to point out, I have taught at the graduate level in good schools in 2 different fields, and neither of which I ever took a course for credit in my life, those being law and economics. So in that case, you know, you just have to make sure your schooling doesn't get in the way of your education. And I suspect there are probably people for whom schools are better. I mean, people differ a whole lot. So my guess is that unschooling would work for a lot of kids, but not for all kids. And it would work better if it didn't have to be home unschooling, because there is the limitation that it's harder to make friends. That's one reason why my daughter's friends are mostly online friends, because that's where she was interacting with other people, mostly in World of Warcraft initially. And incidentally, on a different subject, World of Warcraft is also a useful educational tool. That there's a problem if you are moderately well off, which by the standards of most of history, most of us are. Because you would like to teach your kids that money matters. But when they're little, the things they want you to buy for them cost almost nothing in terms of your resources. Right? Toys are cheap in our world. However, if they're playing World of Warcraft, and they want things bought with online gold, and the way they get online gold is to do something boring for a few hours, they are learning the lessons about saving and working and all of that in a to them real world. So that's sort of an interesting case. I want somebody to do a version of something like World of Warcraft to teach languages. And I don't think anyone has done it yet. But what I want is a fun multiplayer online game in which, when you're a level 1 player, every once in a while the non-player characters use a French word. And they always use it in a place where the context makes it obvious what it means. And as you move up a level, the percentage of French words keeps going up. So you'll be learning to speak it the way people learn languages really. And I bet it could be done. Somebody could even make a fortune doing it, and I throw it out as a free idea. One of my general slogans is that when you're young, you're afraid people will steal your ideas, and when you're old, you're afraid they won't. Yes.
Computers, there was when we learned the evenings, remember, TV games. They come out with instructions. We didn't know really how to read English at the time, but from context.
But what you really want to do is to have a way that makes it fun.
Yes, of course. But we wanted to play Zelda, and to be able to get the clues, we had to...
Yeah, no, there certainly are computer programs that are teaching, but my impression from a long time ago is that you sort of need one inspiration for each.
Yeah.
And as those are going to develop very, very slowly. When I wrote my price theory textbook, I wrote a set of computer programs to go with it. And when I was demoing that in economics meetings, people would say, how many chapters are on the floppy disk? We use floppy disks. And I said, none of the chapters are on the floppy disks. The chapters are in the book where they belong. Anything you can teach better in a book, you can teach better in a book. And at that time, computer instruction was largely doing things you could do in a book on a computer because that was sexy. And what I was trying to do was to do things you couldn't do in a book, but you could do in a computer. And one of my projects that never got finished, which we called Living Paper, was to design a bunch of such programs and then to offer to customize them for everybody else's textbooks. Because it's inefficient to write the programs just for your own book, which I was doing for the fun of it. Was happy with. Anyway. Yes?
Going back to what you said about your online presence being about maybe 90%.
Yes.
It's not unreasonable. How much does that hinge on the internet being decentralized? Like you can't have the state control the infrastructure, the
Yes, no, I agree. The physical infrastructure of the internet could be one of the vulnerabilities, that if the state sufficiently controls it. The situation in China at the moment is that the state pretends to control it. That is, that if you're in China, you theoretically cannot access many information sources outside of China. But anybody who wants to can. That there are in fact workarounds. Now it may be that that's deliberate. Maybe the Chinese government feels the people who really care about it will willing, as long as the masses can't learn what we're lying to them, we don't care if the elite can. And that might be what's going on. So I don't know how hard it is, but there are places which basically you go to them and then they get the stuff that you're not allowed to see and pass it on to you. Everybody, anyone, not everybody, the kind of people I would talk to, professors all know about that. So yeah, no, you could imagine that that would be one of the ways in which you could not get this future if the physical basis for the internet gets grabbed too fast. Yeah. So far, it hasn't probably.
We're starting to run out of time, so we have time for basically one more question, and then maybe we'll perhaps assign some books. I know some authoring machine of Friedman books here. And we have to be out of the venue by 8. But whoever feels they have the most important question, please raise your hand.
Surely you want them to bid for the last one, yes? You raise that first.
Your three best literary literature, your three best books.
Oh boy.
And why?
Ignoring my books. Anarchy, State, and Utopia is quite a good book. Michael Huemer is one of the people I think highly of. And he has one book, The Problem of Political Authority. And I've only read half of it, because I probably should read the rest, because it's probably good. But the rest was make the kind of arguments I make. And what the first half is doing is a professional philosopher taking all of the arguments that other philosophers have offered for why the government can do things that would be wrong if you did them, and dealing with them. And he does a pretty convincing job, I think, of showing that almost all of those arguments are wrong, cannot be maintained. And that the only one he thinks that can be maintained is the argument that says if the state doesn't have these powers, terrible things will happen. And then the second half of the book is the same argument I would make on why you don't have to have a state with the power to do things people can't do in order for terrible things not to happen. So I think, at least if you're likely to be arguing with people about the legitimacy of state action, that's a book you should probably read. But other than that, I'm not sure I can think of any single thing that would be at the top of my list. Probably the book that was most influential for me was Heinlein's novel, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, because that gave me a believable fictional portrayal of a world where the legal system was endogenous, where the legal system was internal. That basically my position before I read that was that you wanted complete laissez-faire, except that you had to have an external source for the framework, for the law and law enforcement. And I thought I could prove that. I just never bothered to sort of fill in dot all the I's and cross the T's, but it seemed sort of obvious that you had to have that in order for the rest of it to work. And then Heinlein gave me what, as far as I can tell, was an internally consistent picture of a society which did function, which didn't have that. A proof is refuted by a single counterexample. And even a fictional counterexample, if it's internally consistent, means there can't be a general proof that it's impossible, and that started me thinking about how in something more like my world you could get people. So I guess for me, at least, that would be the third one. But I can't think of another book that... I tend to write Gordon Tullock was a very original and interesting economist, died a year or so ago, a friend of mine. And he should have gotten the Nobel Prize. That is, he was the co-author of the work that somebody else got a Nobel Prize for. And the reason he didn't is probably because he had offended too many people. Because he was sort of a wild man, but an offending wild man. And there was some exchange where somebody prominent wrote an article, and Tullock wrote a debunking of the article. And the guy who wrote the original article wrote a response in which he argued that Tullock had entirely misread his article. And he started out by saying, we've all been very much impressed by how much Professor Tullock has written. And it's really even more impressive to realize that he wrote so much when he cannot read. Part of the reason I like that line is that exchanging insults with Gordon was sort of awesome. One of the articles I wrote, which actually ended up as eventually as a moderately important article of mine. The incentive to write it was to justify the claim that something that Gordon had written was not only obvious but false. Okay, anyway, that's it. So thank you all.